The first observer spoke, and there was a distinct hint of mocking in its tone. "Tell me, does this constitute a failure?" "It was only a test. Nothing more." To which the first replied, "You sound certain, and that's a worry." The second entity spoke again. "It was just a simple test to discover the human's capacity. That's all. Wait until they encounter real warriors." "You don't say." One could imagine the first entity shaking its head mockingly before speaking. "I really do hope you realize that those above us will not tolerate any error. There will be a price to pay if you fail. After all, it is your plan." The second entity defended its position and strategy with a confidence that some might regard as mere bluster and delusion. "I won't fail." Its companion made him a simple promise: "If you do fail, I'll kill you myself." Chapter 5. I'd been listening to a podcast on poltergeists, and it left me wondering whether these ghosts or spirits had any sort of consciousness, or whether they were only subject to sets of contingencies depending on the furniture available to throw about. It's amazing what springs to mind when I'm shopping. I fancied a bone china tea set in the Red Cross charity shop, and I was in a bit of a dilemma about whether to buy it or not. I didn't need it. I couldn't afford it. But like a poltergeist, it was a contingency in case I received visitors. Then I remembered what Jenny, who is uber tidy, told me about bargains. Apparently, something's only a bargain if you've got somewhere to keep it. I had nowhere to keep anything. What with cows and ghosts ever ready to wander about my living room, I wanted nothing fragile in there, other than my delicate mental state. In the small parotid gland below the angle of my left jaw, an ENT consultant told me there could be as many as 27 different cancers. It's why they dug the bloody tumor out and left me with a noble scar and a perpetual numbness on the extreme left of my face and ear. A few nerves had been damaged or severed and hadn't recovered. Jenny asked me how it felt, and I told her that when I shaved it felt as if I was shaving the backside of someone else's pig. Before Shadow turned up, I'd thought rather, that I wouldn't be too upset if I didn't wake up in the morning. And to be honest, it was a frequent last thought of the day. Life had lost momentum and I was only tumbling along the bottom, armed with simple expectations. Like my garden. I could at least find joy there. Something that was always missing in my interactions with most humans. So I opted to lose myself in simple daily rituals, one following the other, with no gap in between if I could help it. If I kept busy, the more emotionally and psychologically stable I remained. At least that was the theory. By stable, I mean being able to survive each day without any expectation of happiness. I think the only thing that propelled me forward previously was the daft hope of finding someone who'd love me. With all my faults, and there were plenty there. I suppose mental stagnation and inertia aren't attractive to any straightforward woman. I was also aware that anyone who'd been attracted to me in the past had been attracted because of that sadness. Mean people attract mean people, far out there evangelicals attract an equally weird person. Miserable people do the same. Each personality mutually compounds the other's misery as an act of cowardice. People don't seem to realize just how obvious they are. And in the end maybe it doesn't matter? As long as the other identity feels validated. Maybe that's love. If it is, I should have accepted it years ago and not maintained a pointless defense mechanism of pushing people away. Instead, I grew accustomed to solitude and eventually no longer questioned it. Is misery an absence of love or an absence of self-love? I'll leave that on the tree at the top of the track where some bastard once hanged a dead fox. I couldn't imagine that old Eva Hughes would ever have done such an appalling thing. Neither would Edward, or his younger wife in the far too tight t-shirt. It wouldn't have been inappropriate to describe my recent life as constantly off balance, and in near constant anticipation of another appalling event befalling me. Ever since he'd arrived, Shadow, from wherever, made himself at home on my sofa and had been abusing my good nature ever since. Not only did he bring his presence, but he also brought along in his slipstream one unfortunate event after another. The logic was clear and undeniable as far as I was concerned. One day everything was comfortably dull and predictably miserable, and there was a clock counting down. The next? Visitations and monsters turned up in their hordes. Like the universe had been saving them up. It must have been thinking, let's give that miserable fool a good kicking. So much for a lucky black cat. True, Shadow was a cat and he was black, other than the white shield on his chest. However, that's where any feline semblance ended. He was unnamed on arrival and my dear friend decided on Shadow because he disappeared from sight on entering any shadow. She said sometimes people who refuse to realize their blessings irritate the universe, and make it strike back in anger. So anyway, He'll keep you company and might stop you from being so bloody miserable. Thanks, universe. If this is karmic payback, I hadn't realized I'd irritated you that much. I glanced over my shoulder back into the cottage. I could see Shadow squeezed into his favorite corner of the large sofa. A seemingly content little black cat gently snoring away with his paw over his nose. A soppy grandmother's dream cat. Just looking at him, who'd have thought he was the agent of an angry universe? I shook my head in mock despair. It had been a lovely spring day for the most part and just a bit chilly later in the afternoon, but it was a good day for working in the garden. It was hardly a designed garden, but I decided to be ergonomic, if not plain lazy, by only building raised beds wherever the old garden wall had collapsed completely. I once read about the spirit of Kaizen. I think it's about tackling significant challenges, like eating an elephant one bit at a time with a spoon. Whenever I worked in the garden, I concentrated all my attention on what I was doing. I did my best not to even think about all the work that still needed doing before I had my flowers, salad and veggies planted and grown. It worked well enough. And with the companionship of my trusted kettle, things were moving ahead at a gentle, relentless pace. What I couldn't finish this year, maybe Jenny would next year. It was the least I could do to leave it all to her. But right now, on the whole, I was pretty satisfied with the day's work. I was happy here. Maybe content if you adjusted the definition a bit. Doing nothing that might be construed as unconsciously contriving to attract bad events or people towards me. I tried to be neutral and expected to see nothing, which a Catholic might regard as skirting too close to a mortal sin. But I wasn't Catholic and I didn't feel desolate in any way, and I refused Jenny's observation. Sometimes tough love works. But with me, it was like casting apathetic seeds on already apathetic soil. I knew that I was pathologically shy. Yet as I kept telling Jenny, it hadn't made me antisocial, it only made me more discerning about whose company I was willing to accept. She told me that there couldn't be many humans out there who could meet my impossible standards. And I told her that I was neutral, which is where the desolation bit came into her conversation. They may sound like conversations, however, if you were to write them down and analyze them, you'd soon realize it was a determined effort to kick a friend into shape. I daren't share my horrible adventures with her, because she'd have dragged me straight to a doctor. And I have no doubt I'd have been sectioned under the Mental Health Act. Where I am, is in the middle of a series of scary events. I know Job wasn't the one inside the whale, but right then it felt like a whale was the only thing that hadn't been thrown at me yet, all courtesy of the aforementioned sleeping Moggy. It was quiet and no whale inbound that I could see, and Shadow was asleep, which was always a good sign. Yet I still felt tense. Twice that week he'd woken up suddenly and hurried to his automatic door opener, that's me, and hurried out for a sniff and a listen. He appeared to rotate his ears and reflect on the incoming sensory information before returning to bed. Since then I was waiting for trouble. In the meantime, I rested as much as I could in a mildly paranoid sea of anxiety. That aside, there was an old lady who lived in a cottage vaguely similar to mine, not too far away. It had an upstairs. Upstairs meant more storage, and I was downsizing to leave as small a pile of stuff that could be burned in a bin and the rest chucked in a skip. I really didn't want to start collecting anything else. Her cottage was no more than an amble away through my little weed forest, and across a field. And I went shopping for her once a week. When I say old, she's only about 10 years older than me. Nell Davis suffered from a bit of osteoporosis, and as she told me with bitter humor, the bastard thing kept shifting about. It occupied one set of bones today, then somewhere else tomorrow. I was amazed how she remained in good spirits. Nell was very sarcastic and not shy about freely directing it at me. And she had a fascinating history. Having been married 3 times. You could call her a bit of a late-developed free spirit who had initially denied this part of herself by marrying 2 vicars, one after the other. Apparently, the 2 ministers loved themselves more than God, and were either crap or appalling in bed and generally crap as humans. I hadn't actually wanted to know any of those details. Both cared about being the center of attention. They loved funerals and would make the praying last ages, seeking inspiration until the good Lord himself must have wept. The first? She disliked him soon after they married, and discovered that his congregation felt the same. Most of his congregation would have preferred to fetch a spade from the garden shed and bury their own dead, rather than have him officiate. I'll never know why I married the second after the first. He had money, but was as mean and cold as a snail with rabies. Her experience challenged my own about relationships, because she was such a joyful person with a half-full glass of wine. And she really loved her wine. The second was just an appalling person. He was so lacking in the professional social skills of his alleged vocation that he couldn't hide his contempt for his flock. He joined the church in Wales to become a bishop, and ended up as a parish vicar in the middle of bloody nowhere. This he'd attributed to jealousy. But instead he should have attributed it to being an asshole and a monster, according to Nell. She told me that the spirits of the entire parish were raised when both of her husbands died. Nell joked that some of the congregation even brought a spade and a can of petrol to the funeral, just to make sure the second was dead. And stayed dead. Both men were devoid of humor, joy, adventure or compassion, which I suppose is why she'd got it right at last when she fell in love and married Trevor. Trevor was always an inveterate gambler and RFH in bed, apparently, really effing hot. I was given all this information whether I wanted to hear it or not, in case you think I'm a gossip chaser. In Nell's books, like Jenny's, I was a miserable bastard and should at least make some damn effort to be happy. I concluded that I needed more sympathetic women around me. 2 caring female bullies and a vicious cat. That's what I'd been given. Trevor died of cancer 3 years after they married. And rather than indulge in self-pitying grief, her memories of him remained warm and she was full of amusing anecdotes of the fun they'd had together. He was loved for his kindness and being appreciative of everyone, especially those in need of help. Whether that be companionship or just fixing a toilet. His passing left us sadness, but he was still a legendary figure because of his adventures drunk and sober. It had sometimes been difficult to tell the difference between drink and natural exuberance. Trevor didn't have much to leave her, other than wonderful memories of the best years of her life. Despite that, she still managed quite well on the state pension, the small pensions of both earlier husbands, and the occasional win on the lottery. She believed it was Trevor still looking after her. It was enough to sustain her and would see her out. I'd done her weekly shop as usual and taken it across in my trusty rusty Ford Focus, including the mandatory 2 bottles of red wine, for which she'd caught a taste with Trevor. On paper she was drinking too much. In reality she was communing with her RFH lover in sweet memories. I couldn't offer any judgment on that. I'd walked that same walk for a different reason, and somehow managed to get out the other side, still enjoying a glass of wine every night. I'm a private social drinker, she insisted, and I had never seen her any the worse for wear in all the time I'd known her. Nell's cheeks were rosy and her hair fell onto her shoulders grey and straight, which made her lovely round face and piercing green eyes very attractive. Her hair was treated to an expensive perm every couple of months, because she wanted to pretend that she had the curls she'd always wanted as a child. Nell had the sweetest, best auntie in the world smile and remained that until she opened her mouth, and outpoured this appalling and amusing foul language and acid sarcasm. She was a very genuine person, and it's also worth emphasizing her kindness. I was expecting my customary sarcastic affectionate roasting when I knocked on her front door. Instead, when she eventually opened up, I was shocked at the sight of her. She appeared shrunken and dreadfully pale. The wonderful sparkle in her eyes had been extinguished, and in its place was a dull sheen, giving her the appearance of great distress. Her hair was a terrible mess, matted and unkempt, and hadn't been brushed in days. An alarm bell went off in my head and my stomach and heart sank. I'd seen this before with my mother. I put down the shopping bag immediately. Nell's face was pinched and she appeared fearful and very much elsewhere. Her eyes flickered spasmodically, as if she were pursuing or avoiding something. Then finally she mumbled a distracted greeting. This wasn't our Nell. Like I hoped for myself, I wished for my friend to die peacefully in her sleep, and not just fade away into agonizing oblivion. I projected a path for her. From here to hospital, to care home, a dementia care ward, and finally a confused and lingering death from COPD. I could have cried. I was well versed in dancing around painful issues after my mother. Nell, I said, is everything all right? She brought her hands to her face, and let out a brief juddering sigh before raising her eyes to meet my concern. At least I saw recognition there. It's this damn house, she said, and gestured a thumb over her right shoulder. It's beginning to get me down. Anything I can do to help? She looked directly into my eyes. I saw confusion and distraction, but thankfully no panic. It seemed to be mostly exhaustion. Beyond even your limited skill set for a reasonably useful human being, she said. I don't think I've ever been so delighted to be insulted by anyone. Maybe you can send the cat around, she said. Curious she should say that. You've got rats, I asked. I only wish I was that lucky. I tell you what. I'll give you Shadow, but you'll have to give me a shilling for him. A shilling? She appeared to relax. Someone told me it's bad luck to give anyone a sharp object unless you receive a shilling in exchange for it. A Romany thing about giving someone a knife, I think. Deadly knife versus dangerous cat. The offer earned a weak smile from somewhere. I'll think about it. Her shoulders dropped and I was sorely tempted to put my arms around her. Not much company, I'll warrant you that. Shadow does nothing but eat and sleep. He could at least help with the hoovering. Add secret farting to that, and he'll be like my first two, she said. That was better. I can vouch for all three. Now what's worrying you? She looked back over her shoulder into the cottage and was serious once again. I think this house is getting too much for me. I keep hearing voices. Really? We were back in murky waters and the canoe was leaking again. Nell shook her head. I think I spend too much time on my own. She paused between thoughts. Now, how much do I owe you for the shopping? I handed her the invoice. Everything you wanted. I even bought a bottle of your favorite Sauvignon for myself. Nell didn't seem to hear me as she took the invoice and kept looking over her shoulder. I'd usually have been invited in for a cup of tea and one of her lovely cakes by now. I was surprised not to be, but I put it down to her apparent condition. I'm sure there's nothing to worry about, I said. I'll fetch you the money. There's no hurry. No. I always want to stay straight with you. You're a good man, and they're few and far between these days. She disappeared into the cottage. I looked about her cottage and the herb garden she still maintained. The rest had been given over to a small lawn that another friend mowed for her once a week. All looked as tidy as ever. Nell returned and gave me the exact money and I thanked her. Give me a call if anything worries you, I said, and I'll send Shadow around straight away. It was a weak joke. The look we exchanged left me more concerned. I could see that there was something she wanted to tell me. But she was a proud and independent woman. So we had to leave it there. Nell and I texted each other occasionally. Each of us checking that the other was still alive, and not mouldering behind the sofa and leaking on the carpet, as she liked to say. I waved to her from the small gate and set off for home, perturbed. I'd seen dementia close up and knew that unexpected fear was one of the symptoms to expect. And Nell, fiercely independent Nell, was very, very scared. So I resolved to call her more often. I'd been keeping a diary for a few years, but not as a record of a potentially depressing lack of events in my life. And neither did I make a record of shadow-related events, because if anyone saw those, I'd have been heading up to the big house on the fast D-Dar bus. I made a list of individual things I needed to do each day. It added punctuation to what might otherwise be considered a featureless day. Things to do was specific, and would leave me a bit disappointed if I didn't get around to finishing the list, which is why I occasionally ended up working into the dark just to tick them all off. Items were as follows. I got up early, made myself a cup of coffee and fed the cat. Shadow usually woke me up at about 6:20 a.m., to irritate me mostly and to see if I felt like feeding him. Next, I walked up and down the track half a dozen times, about 3 miles. I performed my stretches at each end and would still occasionally listen to my French lessons on my headphones as I pottered up and down. Obviously a futile gesture. Then it was a final up and down with some dumbbells, and that was me done outside. Inside, very rarely, I did some agonizing stomach crunches. For some unfathomable reason, even at this late stage, I decided that I wanted a six-pack. I ticked off these achievements in my diary every morning, and then had a late breakfast, 8:30 a.m., thanks to Shadow who was usually back in Betty Bobo's land by then. Afterwards, I'd get on with the day's tasks, and then tick them all off one by one. I did very little on Sunday, just pottering around the place, and a visit to the cemetery before doing some shopping, just to be among humans for a while. If I didn't do that, then I'd feel old and confused relative to the week. An old friend told me that a routine is vitally important for a healthy psychology. All I had to do to gain a routine was to do the same things 21 times. I now know that to be true, because if extreme weather and cat-related events got in the way of my daily routines, I felt the loss. And the day always felt incomplete. It was growing dark, and I'd carried on working beyond supper time to complete a big job. I was outside with a mug of tea and sat on the wall of the raised bed I'd just finished. It was the biggest so far, about 15 feet long by say 8 feet across. It had started out as a rectangle and ended up as a misshapen oval. I didn't think that the carrots and potatoes I intended to plant there would mind either way. I built up each raised bed to a sitting height for sheer convenience and to avoid lower back problems. I was pleased, and playing my usual fantasy game. I imagined myself creating a perfect flower and vegetable garden full of color and delight. Gardens are demanding work, and I'd promised myself to stop every now and then during summer, to just enjoy the place. So many gardeners forget to do that, until the lobelias turned brown. By then, summer's over. That's what I was doing when I became aware of a sound, a disturbing droning coming from somewhere. No, not somewhere. It was all around me. I could feel it in my tummy as a near high-frequency type of whistling. It pulsed gently in long, slow ululating amplitudes. I stood up and checked above me, in case a drone or a Coast Guard helicopter was flying nearby. There was nothing. Maybe it was a vehicle up on the main road. I was familiar with every sound in the area, usually by their absence when they suddenly stopped. It was none of the familiar local noises, and I knew I'd become unwell if it persisted much longer. There's an Royal Air Force base on the island. So maybe the sound was coming from there. On the other hand, the island enjoyed a prevailing southwesterly wind that might bring the sound from further away. So I didn't think it was a lorry or tractor. Other than that, maybe Fu Manchu was on a comeback tour. Had I been bothered, then I might have used one of the social media platforms I hate so much, if only to see how the world of the conspiratorially inclined was taking it. The noise could well have been coming from the underwater alien base off Puffin Island, and that meant all the loonies would be online. I was still trying to assess where the noise was coming from, when another development obliged me to utter the words. Oh crap! Shadow was in the cottage doorway. And he was wearing his trouble at mill face, rotating his head, trying to find the source. I need a rest, I shouted across the garden to him. I was actually quite angry. That meant surprisingly little to Shadow, as he barely noticed my presence, let alone attend to my plea. But of course, what I wanted was irrelevant to the cat. My role was feeding him and being his automatic door opener, that's all. But after a few moments he was looking in my direction, albeit inquiringly. No point looking this way. This is definitely your territory. He stared down at his paws, and I did the same with my feet. And I could feel the same vibration he was feeling over there by the cottage. More trouble, I inquired. The droning stopped suddenly. Shadow remained where he was, looking uncertain. I wouldn't say it like that. He stayed there for a few more moments, then performed an about turn and re-entered the cottage. I walked across and looked in with trepidation, thankfully finding him back on his bed and asleep with a paw over his nose as usual. He was probably still contemplating the noise, but in the meantime all seemed well with the world. I made my supper of chicken and mushroom pie, mashed peas and gravy. I rewarded myself with a half tumblerful of the Sauvignon while I was at it. As usual, it was a substantial meal for one that ended up shared with a suddenly interested furry another. That meal I learned that Shadow didn't like pastry. So I decided spitefully that I should live on pies. However, he did love gravy, the granulated stuff. For once I managed to keep most of the food out of his bowl. I'd ticked off all the items in the diary and felt quite happy on the sofa with a tumbler of wine on the small table in front of me. I was listening to a podcast by the poet laureate, Simon Armitage. I'd been envious of him since I learned that he had a lovely garden shed overlooking the moors. And not a tumble-down field loo that looked like it might collapse if you sniggered at it or broke wind too loudly. I was only pretending to tidy up when my mobile phone rang. That meant I had to find the damn thing. Unless it was a call from India about my accident, it could only be one of 3 people. Then I remembered Nell's distress and jumped to my feet. I found the phone in my bedroom and it was her name on the display screen. Nell. I could barely hear her. Nell. I felt a bitter cold run down my spine. When she spoke, I knew Nell was crying, and I sensed a terror in her voice. I'm really scared. It was a long drawn-out scared. I'm on my way. Bring Shadow with you, please. Again. How could she know? Maybe he wandered off closer than the other side of the galaxy. I'll try, I said, tentatively wondering how the hell I was supposed to achieve that miracle without sustaining a fatal injury. I still bore faint scars on my hand to show what he could do if he felt truly violent. We'll be there as quickly as we can. I don't know why I'd worried, because Shadow was ready and waiting, and wearing his scary game face. I opened the door as commanded, and as I reached for my coat he was off, heading straight for the woods. He obviously knew where Nell lived. And he obviously knew that the quickest route there was through the woods and the field. Being Shadow, he quickly disappeared into the late evening woodland gloom. I made my way as best I could, using the torch on my mobile phone to save me from grief. Now and then I flashed the light ahead and saw the retinal reflection of Shadow's eyes, checking that I was following. I didn't catch up with him until I arrived at the farm gate a few yards from Nell's. Shadow vaulted over her garden wall while I used the gate. Both of us were as breathless as each other when we arrived at her door, to find the lights off and the door ajar. Shadow was in like a shot as I called out, "Nell! We're here!" Someone fell on me out of the darkness and grabbed onto my arm with such desperate force that I nearly had a heart attack. I cried out in shock and dropped the mobile phone. "Bloody hell," I gasped and bent to pick up my phone. I was shocked to see this wonderfully bright and breezy foul-mouthed angel in a much worse state of disarray. That morning, she'd been worried and distracted, but now I was looking at someone I barely recognized. Her eyes were wide in terror and she seemed on the verge of hysterics. Darkness had always brought such a terrible fear for my mother. Now, like her, Nell seemed inconsolably terrified. "What's the matter?" I asked. She pulled my hand to her cheek and I could feel the wetness of her tears. "Oh, help me please. He just keeps coming back." Shadow sped down the stairs, stopped beside us, sat his ass down on the floor and stared into the living room kitchen. Nell almost cried in relief that a cat had come to visit her. "Our little savior's here," she said. Nell reached down and patted Shadow on his head gently, and he did nothing, other than reaching his head up to her. My God! If I tried that I'd be dead before the nerves could send a half-decent message declaring gross stupidity to my useless brain. He looked up, daring me to say something inappropriate. I chose survival instead. "I've seen what this guy can do." He dropped his head and went to sit in the middle of the small hallway, sending out his sight and hearing in every direction. I saw that she was more settled now her savior was here. And I suddenly felt an inappropriate guilty resentment that my mate went around adopting houses and people other than me. "Why don't you come to mine? Just for a while until we sort out what's going on here?" "I'll go and fetch the car," I said. "And Shadow can wait here with you." I checked with the cat, who didn't look like he was listening to this human stuff. She shook her head and released my arm. "It doesn't matter where I go. He'll always find me." This was a familiar landscape. "Who'll find you?" "My second husband," she said quietly. "That evil bastard. But he's dead. You told me yourself that half the island turned up to make sure he was dead. Clearly we didn't make sure enough." Shadow was an observant smart cat who didn't intervene anywhere unless something horrible happened. Seeing him on full alert, I began to suspect Nell's mental health just might be in a better state than mine. And I bet myself the cat was dragging me into more ghostly crap. If it wasn't monsters with Shadow, then it was ghosts. My life was really tanking. "Right. I think we all need a cup of tea. Is that all right?" I deferred to the cat's reading of this strange situation. He cast another glance up the stairs before walking into the living room kitchen. Nell sat at her large rustic kitchen table where we frequently sat. It was usually both of us at one end opposite each other, and her cake-making bowls and pots the other end. It was a pleasant room to be in with the heat from her oil-fired aga keeping it nice and toasty cozy. I always felt that this is where I paid my dues to the universe, keeping an elderly lady company, eating her homemade shortbread biscuits, which were extraordinarily good, and taking her lectures about wasting my life and similar admonishments on the chin. We sat opposite each other, each of us with a mug of tea. I looked around Nell's perfect country kitchen and managed to keep the shock from my face. Her pride and joy was in as much of a mess as her mind, although I was beginning to question my immediate diagnosis. The fact that Shadow had known intuitively something was wrong suggested it was more than mental decline. Also, if he was here, then there had to be trouble brewing. And clearly Nell was the object of its attention. Many of the cupboards were half open, and a large earthenware jar of flour lay in pieces smashed on the floor. I got the impression that Nell had started several tasks in this kitchen, but distraction had left each incomplete. While I'd been making tea, I saw her favorite navy blue teapot lying on its side in the sink with its spout broken. I stole a glance in her larder and saw that both bottles of wine I'd brought her were untouched. It was a relief that she wasn't drunk. I also noticed that only one of the bottles I'd bought her the previous week had been opened. I placed her mug of tea in front of her and sat down. Books and little boxes had fallen off shelves onto the work surfaces or the floor, and if it weren't for Shadow's insistence on being here, I would have called for an ambulance the minute we arrived. Instead, I offered Nell an uncertain smile. For a moment her eyes stopped wandering about the room, the hall and upstairs. She returned my smile weakly. "Thank you both for coming," she said. "I feel a bit embarrassed for causing you such inconvenience." However, there was more relief than embarrassment in her smile. "I haven't been drinking." I gave her another smile. "I noticed you hadn't opened the Sauvignon." Her eyes turned to the hallway, where I imagined Shadow was still sat on ghostly radar duty. "You?" I shrugged. "Just a glass. It was a full day in the garden." "Maybe you should do the same as me," she said. Instead of building a big garden, you should be simplifying it. It's just one last desperate push to try and achieve one of my daft dreams, I said, and held up a hand and smiled. And don't get on my case. She shook her head. Where's that cat? I think he's still in the hallway. Come here, kitty, she called out in a high voice and tapped her lap when he came in. And I'll be damned, the savage little brute jumped up on her lap, but not before giving me one of his looks. You don't always have to fight to win certain battles, I think he was telling me. He allowed Nell to hug him tight and settle down even though his ears were still scanning. You're a special little cat, she told him, as if his ego wasn't big enough already. You know more things than most people. He really is a special cat. She looked up at me for confirmation. He's a complicated cat, I replied, which made her laugh. He's the type of cat who'd throw Lassie down a mine shaft and claim credit for finding him. Nell cupped Shadow's little face in her hands and stared deeply into his eyes. He knows what's happening. The larger panic had gone and she felt safe. She closed her eyes and gave Shadow another meaningful hug, then opened them and looked about her messed up kitchen. I know it looks like I've lost the plot, she said. Things have been happening here that scare me. And believe you me, I'm not one to get scared. I pointed at Shadow. I can guarantee he wouldn't be here unless something was wrong. So tell us what's been going on. It took her a moment to find words that would make it sound real for her, and not ridiculous to anyone else. Then finally she looked down at Shadow and found the courage to speak to him in a faltering voice. Yesterday was the anniversary of when my second husband died. Then she was silent. I'd noticed long ago that she never mentioned his name. I think she was remembering those special things that made him a bastard hated by anyone who had ever come into his orbit. I gave her an encouraging nod to continue. She took a big breath and decided to speak a truth she'd probably rehearsed many times but never said aloud. I trust you both. Then she paused to think. My husband died because he fell off a ladder while cleaning the gutters. Okay. Tragic, I thought, but these things happen. It was me. I pushed the ladder and made sure he fell onto the garden wall. I blinked. She was silent, and looked straight into my eyes, maybe looking for shock and disgust. The cat might be the expert of so much unknown to me, but I knew Nell was no immoral killer. Hell. I'd done plenty of killing recently. Even killing overgrown, violent and voracious chicken turkey monsters must have some moral implications. I pondered that for a moment. No, it didn't. I hate fox hunting unless the hunters intend to eat the poor beast. There had to be a purpose beyond killing. Go on, I said. He fell onto the wall and crushed his head horribly. Nell winced. I made sure he was long dead before I phoned the ambulance. She pulled Shadow tight to her. I'm a murderer, Shadow. You must be disgusted. I thought about this for a brief moment. Here was a woman confessing to the murder of a husband, a village vicar, who everyone hated. And she was a dear friend confessing to a known psychopath cat. So there was no need for people to bring petrol and spades to the funeral. I killed a vicar. I realized I was probably giving her the understanding she'd hoped for and not the one she'd anticipated. From what you say, I guess that was just a convenient uniform for him. I cocked one eye at Shadow and he cocked one straight back. I guess you wouldn't have done it unless he deserved it. And there's me. Judge and jury. I looked around the kitchen again. And the mess. Maybe guilt always finds a way out, directly or indirectly. The mind's tricky like that. Go on, I said. It counted as a sudden death. My God, it was like Zed Cars and Dixon of Doc Green out there. There was no humor in her explanation. She took another breath and seemed relieved to be talking about it at last. 2 police cars with their sirens and lights. And an ambulance. Like I said, to them it was a sudden death. And there had to be an inquest and a coroner's report, I said. Death by misadventure, she answered. She was watching me keenly. I've got so many people wrong over the years. But there were a few, like Nell, with whom my instincts had always been right. I said, I think I know you well enough that you must have had a damned good reason. It wouldn't have held up in court in those days. Today people and courts tend to be more understanding. Just out of interest, I know that you loved Trevor very much, but the first vicar, you didn't happen to kill him as well, did you? She was reassuringly appalled by the thought. No, of course not. The first one was a wet blanket. He married because a vicar should be married. Did you know we never had sex because he thought it was sinful? He just became more and more bland, and then one day I found him dead in his armchair. I think he died because he was just too bland. Just stopped breathing according to the pathologist. Apnea, I think he said. So you're not a Black Widow? Of course not. She admonished me firmly and looked down at Shadow, who seemed quite comfortable where he was. Dear Shadow, you have an awful friend. Not like Trevor, I asked. Right, listen up. You should be like Trevor before it's too late. You've never had sex until you've had sex against a gravestone at midnight on Halloween. Worth all the scratches. I held up my hand. Please. Too much information. We laughed. Good memories to have. If you have them, that is. Right. Tell us what's been going on. Like you said, it takes a lot to scare you. Shadow stood up on her lap and she let him jump off. He trotted out into the hallway again. I had no idea what he was really doing out there. But I could see her concern over the lack of his reassuring presence. He's just in the hallway, I said. You were saying. When he was the vicar, he used to have Bible classes on Wednesday evenings in the rectory where we used to live. In the beginning, parents would accompany their children and have a cup of tea with me while the children, about a dozen at the beginning, went into the other room with him. I was the vicar's wife, so it was my job to be sociable. Then the children would come on their own after a while. I knew what was coming. I'd have killed the bastard myself. Nell continued. Everything seemed all right for a while. And I think the children liked coming here because I'd make cakes for them and they'd have real orange juice. So anyway, I left them to it and usually just pottered about in the garden. Nell was an inveterate potterer. It's where I usually found her when I came round with her shopping. You didn't live here those days, so you wouldn't have known him. She paused a moment to catch her breath and order her sentences. I have to tell you that he was a brute of a man, well over 6 foot, and he was over 20-odd stone. It was his weight that killed him in the end. I just helped him along. But like I said, he was a brute. Brutal enough to scare me and do whatever he wanted any time it suited him. She shuddered. Did anybody else know? I shouldn't think so. You never know what goes on between husband and wife once the front door's closed. I'd always wondered why there was no picture of him in the house. Or the first for that matter. I nodded for her to continue. All the village children knew me as Auntie Nell, and I'd always give them a little something from the garden, and the little orchard in the back if I could. The Bible classes then spread across 3 evenings and were a bit of a bloody nuisance, and the children would come in pairs or individually. Then all of a sudden, none of the children came to see me before they went home. They would be pale and frightened and just run away. When I asked him about the children, he would just shoo it away angrily. Then she was silent. It didn't take you long to work out what was going on, I said. No. When I confronted the bastard, he flew into such a rage that he threw me against the sink there, she gestured over her shoulder, and broke my arm in 2 places. He was evil through and through. And yet the bastard would be up in his bloody pulpit preaching Old Testament, Sunday after Sunday. I reckon it was all done to scare the poor children. Finally, years after he died, 2 of the children, now grown up, came and told me what he'd done to them. They actually came out and thanked me for killing him. They'd worked it out somehow. I didn't know what to say. I don't think anyone would, I said. I take it that when the news about the children came out it was hushed up. Church and state worked together those days. Of course, she said. The police, the coroner, and everyone knew about it long before the inquest. I think everyone guessed what had happened to him. There was no reason he should have fallen. But nothing was said. I heard it was one of the shortest inquests on record. And what happened to the children? I feel so horribly guilty I didn't kill the bastard sooner. I only hope they had some help eventually. Nell petered out. Different days and different rules. Then I heard heavy movement in the room above us. Nell looked up. That's him again. She rose to her feet and shook her fists at the ceiling. Go back to hell and rot, you evil bastard, she seethed. I could see she was terrified. Mind you, so was I. A large piece of furniture was being dragged across the floor above us. There was absolutely no subtlety here. Suddenly Shadow was back in the room. His gaze dark and feral and fixed directly above us. The scraping moved to another part of the room above. And Shadow was away out of the kitchen like a shot, and I heard him bound up the stairs. Stay here. I'm not bloody staying down here alone, she said. Nell was out of the door before I got off my seat and called over her shoulder. The safest place in this house right now is next to your cat. I wish he gave me that kind of confidence. I shrugged and chased after her. Have you seen the bastard? Sort of, she called over her shoulder. He's never seemed to have been able to turn up completely before, but I've smelled his stench. He always stank of corruption. More stairs. I'd been through this before. There was something horrible up the stairs and I didn't want to reach the top. However, neither did I want to be shamed in front of an elderly lady and a cat. My resolve was challenged immediately after those thoughts passed through my dim brain, when I heard the sound of glass being shattered and wood being splintered. "That's my mother's dressing table," Nell hissed to me when we reached the top of the stairs and nearly trod on Shadow. The bastard. For some reason he always hated that. Shadow sat on the threshold of one of the bedrooms, assessing silently. Because it was dark I could only guess what was going on in there. Ghosts still scared me. And I preferred to see them in light. 2 other doors had been smashed inwards, and the bathroom was in a hell of a state. I got the impression that the toilet bowl was the only thing left undamaged. The medicine cabinet had been thrown to the floor in violent anger, and medicines and bath salts were strewn everywhere. Much the same for the other room, which I guessed was used for storage. Cardboard boxes had been shredded and their contents lay smashed or torn. I looked down at Shadow, who was silent and still. He raised his head and looked upwards to his right. All I could see was a light switch. It was clear he wanted me to switch it on. So I reached over him and did as I was commanded. My role as a sidekick was limited, but I still had my uses. And a definite height advantage. The light went on in the bedroom and the noise of smashing furniture stopped immediately. I glanced in and could see broken furniture and clothes strewn everywhere. Nell's hand grabbed mine before I could comment. She leaned up and whispered, "Leave it to Shadow." At that moment I wasn't sure who was holding whose hand, but I was glad of the warm human contact. I watched him. Shadow wasn't a curious cat. Shadow was a careful cat, and he was busy considering the information he was picking up. Nell gripped my arm with her spare hand and whispered, "He doesn't seem afraid." I whispered back, "I'd say the opposite. I reckon anything with any sort of intelligence is scared of him." I heard the tremor in my voice and decided to shut up because it would scare me. Now someone was trying to open drawers. Shadow continued to sit rock solid and indomitable. It felt as if he were a great warrior sending his aura ahead of him to scare the opposition. But then it became silent. And all I could hear was my tinnitus, which I found curiously reassuring. I got the distinct impression that whatever was in the room was now aware of our presence. To me, Shadow was a strange little cat. To Nell, he was her savior. And I'd seen too many things recently to question her faith and confidence in him. I whispered into the silence, "What's he looking for in there?" The noise of smashing then recommenced. Was there anything else left in there to smash, I wondered? Instead of answering, she pointed to Shadow. He slowly raised himself to his feet and indulged in a long stretch before stepping into the room, his bearing strong. And carrying his authority lightly. We both leaned over to see what was going on as Shadow walked to the center of the room and sat down facing the side we couldn't see. He could easily have been standing at my door waiting for me to open it for him. I knew nothing scared him. Or he'd seen much worse in his time. Knowing Shadow, he'd probably done worse. However, all he did was sit there and stare upward. If he were human, I would have sworn he was affecting an angry, impatient boredom. But then the noise started again, and something heavy was shifted around. Nell took this as her opportunity and pulled my hand. "Let's go face the old bastard." Was everyone out to ensure that my life became as awkward and frightening as it could be? I must have been the only entity in the house that was terrified at that moment. Apart from the entity in the room, if it had any sense. I didn't know what Shadow was going to do, but I was about to have an unobstructed view. This stuff must surely be damaging at some fundamental human level, and yet why was none of it crippling me? Then I thought, it probably was. Instead of running away like the avowed coward I'd really like to be, I allowed an elderly lady to pull me in to meet her worst nightmare. What was I worried about? Everything, was the simple answer. Still, I was towed into the silent room, one ruined from all the shards of mirror glass and the debris of a torn-apart wardrobe on the floor. Bastard. Nell certainly wasn't holding back. And I had to agree with her. I'd be really pissed off if someone did this to my cottage. Compared to this, Eva Hughes's efforts were amusing. Notwithstanding Eva, I was led into the center of the room, Nell squeezing my hand so hard I feared for the circulation. So I faced my third ghost in about 6 or 7 weeks. Life just had to get better. Although there was nothing in this room to suggest it would be any time soon. I now believe that most people wouldn't recognize a ghost if they saw it. Maybe they pass among us invisible all the time. Maybe you have to be switched on to see them. I believed there had to be an appropriate connection between you and a ghost that your nerve endings acknowledge and then start ringing. So far it's just a theory in development. Early days. Moving on toward the massive ghost with the squashed head, the outwardly sticking skull bone fragments and the decayed brain matter where his ear used to be. There he stood, in all his appalling sickly grey cadaverousness. It appeared taken aback by the presence of Shadow. The latter was staring up at him in an indifferent aggressive manner, which seemed to puzzle the ex-vicar and thankfully dead murdered husband of Nell. And then, the heavily indented and malformed head turned towards us, and we both discovered that it's true what they tell you about malevolent creatures. Their eyes really do blaze red. Neither of us moved. We should have been running down the stairs and out the front door screaming into the night, but insanely, both of us felt safe. Simply because of a small black cat who looked bored as if he was waiting for a child to finish its supermarket tantrum. Our little friend seemed so cool that I was surprised he hadn't started manicuring his savage claws. As I said, Nell's ex-husband's head was crushed on the left-hand side. My internal Sherlock told me that she had pushed him from the right. He was as tall and monstrous as she had described when he was alive, and curiously present now in a lurid grey-green pallor. That's decay for you, I suppose. He was dressed in a ragged and dirty black suit that seemed too big for even his appalling frame. And it wasn't what he was holding in his left hand that was intriguing. That was only a wardrobe door. It was his thumb. It was in the wrong place. It looked as if someone had detached his arm and sewn it back on the wrong side of his body. I couldn't see his other arm, but the odds were high that the correct left arm was there. I felt no panic. Instead, I was intrigued, and turned to Nell, who seemed equally at ease with this Danse Macabre character. I take it for granted that the Undertaker hated him as well. I think you're right, she whispered conspiratorially from the corner of her mouth like a county councillor. I'm surprised his head's facing the right way. Probably never looked better, I suggested. She nodded. Being dead really suits him. So why aren't I terrified? Probably nothing can be as bad as your imagination, I proposed. Then there's Shadow. The giant swiveled his head from Shadow to us and then back. It was probably a lot for him to take in, having witnesses to his violence. The movement offered us a less than charming view of part of the inside of his skull. First, he needed a good wash. Mind you, by the state of his nails and fingers, he looked like he'd just dug his way out of a grave. Secondly, like I said, his skin was a cadaverous grey-green and taut against his massive skull on the right-hand side, with the hair unkempt and sticking out in all directions. His eyes were pulsing red orbs in sunken black pits, and they were both glaring at Shadow with hatred. Thirdly, again there was the left-hand side of his head. It was like an appalling magnet for my attention. That was a sight that made me feel queasy, and I was glad that the passing years in a grave or at the gates of hell had dealt with all the lurid bleeding and brain bits. Still, it was an almighty and unholy mess looking down at us, confused and holding the door above his head. I saw that Nell was inspecting him closely. He's teetering above hell. That's why he's desperate enough to rise like this, she said. And I think Shadow's keeping him there. That appalling observation was the end of our little hiatus of mutual inspection, as the door came crashing down on the floor. It was miraculous that none of us was injured by the debris. I put that down to Shadow, who must have been protecting us all. If anything strange happens, blame the cat. Nell's ex then proceeded to roar at the top of his voice as his retro fist smashed into the ceiling plaster. Damn you, he roared, as his face distorted and the debris on the floor rattled. Where is it? The rasping, hacking voice suited his condition and recent alleged abode. Amusingly, it seemed delayed a second behind the lip movements. I had no theory to fit that into. I could only describe what I saw and heard. This bastard must have terrified those poor children all those years ago. I pulled Nell back as he lunged toward her and brought down a foot that smashed into the remains of the dressing table mirror. I turned my back to it and embraced Nell to stop her from being injured, expecting the blow to kill me. The arms might be wrong, but the man was still massive and strong. I held her tight, covered her head and waited for the blow to land. Why the hell did Nell marry this monster? Ghost or no ghost? There was a horrible physicality here, I was thinking in those my last moments. Where is it? Damn you. He rasped from the edge of the abyss, and I imagined psychic spittle being sprayed over my back. The blow never landed. I felt Nell struggling against me. She pushed me away in her anger and frustration at being held. Where you'll never find it, you evil bastard. She spoke in a seething cold voice, but still felt the need to grasp my hand. Find what? I was half turned toward him when Shadow raised himself on all fours, took a single step toward Nell's ex and sat down again to continue staring at him. I saw our ghost banging his arms against some invisible barrier that flashed sparks every time he struck this non-existent thing. He roared and pointed a thick dirty finger with a torn black nail at Shadow. "Send that blasted thing away, or I will destroy this house," he roared. Nell was in front of me and clearly wanted a leading role in defying and dispatching this monster to where he was long overdue. "No you won't," she laughed as she shouted at him. Shadow's calmness seemed to lend her courage, or at least she felt it was. Me? I was in one of those Captain Cook cultural shock moments again, and felt as if I was only there by remote control. I just hoped I wouldn't embarrass myself by fainting or peeing in my pants. "Send it away or I will never leave you in peace, woman. Do you not hear?" The gap in time between the lip movements and the voice was most disconcerting. His threats would have sounded legitimate, if we hadn't begun to smell his fear. We both looked down at Shadow, and it seemed like some magical wind was ruffling his fur. Nell was again squeezing my arm. "Isn't he wonderful?" Nell let go of me and embraced herself in delight. "I told you he was special." A smile broke across her face like a golden beam of sunshine banishing the darkness. Was everyone but me mad? Her smile against his torrid glare. It seemed to infuriate him beyond reason. In an uncontrollable rage he began smashing his reversed fists at the invisible sparking curtain hanging in the air between us. Nell took a step toward her tormentor, but thankfully Shadow quickly hopped in her way. I pulled her back and gripped her hand. Nell might have been underestimating the situation, however Shadow certainly wasn't. "You should be gone. Forever." Nell counterpointed each word with a violent index finger. "You should be in hell where you belong, you evil cruel bastard." The ghost did his best to roar away her words and accusations. But Nell was on a roll. "How many lives did you destroy before I even met you? God hates you for what you did. And me and everyone who ever met you hates you. Go back to where you belong. Or I'll destroy it tonight. And you'll be roasting your sorry carcass in hell by morning." I got the impression that both Shadow and I were more for him roasting his sorry carcass in hell without any further delay. There could only be one outcome here. A negotiated peace with a monster was no peace at all. Whatever Nell was talking about destroying, he was desperate to get his hands on it. "It's time you went to hell, you foul animal." Frequently, it's not violence that does the most significant damage to a life, but words and ideas and the intentional curse contained within them. I'm not sure on what temporal scales of self-reflection ghosts exist, however, it seemed there was enough in her words to send him lumbering backwards to the bedroom wall. He brought his two reversed hands together before his destroyed face, all of which were beginning to make me feel nauseous. "Anything," he implored Nell, and then almost soundlessly, as his head fell onto his chest in defeat, he whimpered, "Anything." For a man who said he feared nothing but God, how does it feel to be abandoned? The giant uncurled himself for one final push against Shadow's barrier, and the floorboards beneath began to move under his desperate pressure. I worried that Shadow's strength might not be enough. Nell and I took a step back as the space in the room appeared to contract and become disjointed. "I'll find you again," he said. I stared at Shadow, who was now up on all four legs and leaning forward right into the blast of the man's rage, and the fur flowed wildly over his head and back. "No you won't," she said with finality. "Now bugger off. Before I really set the cat on you. This ends now." Nell turned her back and left the room, leaving Shadow and me and ironically a terrified ghost. "You chose the wrong person to piss off," I said. "Right, Shadow. Finish this." And that's what he did. Shadow did it by simply walking toward a 7-foot ghost. A 1-foot-nothing cat versus a wraith from a nearby hell. Shadow stepped relentlessly forward and squashed the space around the ghost until it melted into the wall with a pretty horrific scream, which I found quite satisfying when I think back on it. Cryptocurrency might be a dodgy bet at best, but Shadow was always a dead cert. Well done. Nice bit of work that. I leaned over suddenly unwell and let out a long exhausted breath. That's enough for one day. The cat kept his own counsel and dismissed me from his thoughts, just like he'd done the ghost. Then, affecting boredom, he exited the room after Nell. After all that, all I could think was, who's going to clean up this bloody mess? Guess who? Muggins here, that's who. I straightened my feet and weebled back slowly and shrugged. Nell sat in the kitchen with Shadow on her lap, scratching him between his ears. She shook like a leaf but managed to smile. I switched on the kettle. Following the earlier pre-crisis tea, this was definitely post-crisis tea. In an attempt to lighten the mood, I said, I don't think I've got enough space in my diary to cover all of that. And I'll need a thesaurus. There has to be a load of synonyms for terrified. Nell said nothing. She understood that when your head's full you've got to say inane things to empty the space, and create room for thoughts of Bambi and a nice green salad. So I returned to making the tea and tidying up while waiting for the kettle to boil. Shadow had a bowl of milk beside Nell's chair and I raided her larder, and came out with an unopened pack of addictive digestive biscuits. I sat down opposite her, now back in my neutral state. I rubbed my eyes. I was so tired. Tell me, I said. What were you going to destroy? She reached down and patted Shadow on his head. Then she looked up at me. I told you this isn't the first time he's been back. Every other time I've managed to stave him off with threats. But it's exhausting, so damned exhausting. He might have won this time if it hadn't been for you too. That's nice, I thought. At least I was getting some credit from someone for turning up. Nell continued. When I first sensed him, he felt dark and terrifying, but now he seems to be fading to grey and far more desperate. More dangerous. Which means he's losing his battle. It's what I said up there. She took a sip of her tea. You make a lovely cup of tea. Are you going to hoard those biscuits? I handed the packet across. I really should have put them on a plate. Nell took one and dipped it in her tea and nibbled it skillfully. After a moment's reflection she said, he's doing his best not to be cast down into hell. He's desperate to save his soul, for what it's worth. Someone or something told him that if he got hold of his body in any form, he could walk the earth forever rather than go to hell. I think he found that option more attractive. Okay. Hang on. He's already got his body. We saw it upstairs. Didn't we? No, you didn't. What you saw. What do they call it today? She looked at Shadow and found the word. An avatar or something like that. One that shows his corruption. But the reversed arms and the hole in his head? I had him cremated because I had a sort of premonition that evil bastards like him are difficult to kill off. The undertaker must have done the arms and head before he was cooked. One of his grandchildren attended Bible class, but luckily he was too smart to go more than once. The undertaker must have done it out of spite, so that everybody in the afterlife would know he was a bad man. A sort of undertaker's secret thing. I'd better behave then, I said. I'd better blow myself up and spare them their games. Yes, you'd better. And get on with your life as well. I'm fed up of telling you by now. So the body he's using is a residual image of its last form. I'm sure it's something like that. She dipped her biscuit again and nibbled away. I finally twigged what was going on. I take it you've got the bastard's ashes hidden somewhere. Nell nodded mischievously. An old lady came to thank me for killing him. She rolled her eyes. Anywhere else and they'd have thrown me in jail and forgotten about me. Anyway, she said she had insight. She was a white witch. And she insisted that I make a block of salt and pop his ashes in it to make them invisible. Just in case. I frowned as I reached for another biscuit. Which meant his threats became more and more violent, I said. You have to end this now. Once and for all. Shadow seemed to be listening intently to our conversation. I'm going to need your help with that. She scratched Shadow's head again. We have to go somewhere a cat can't or won't go. I'm not sure I want to go anywhere Shadow can't go. Where? The Holyhead Dublin Ferry. Ah. On 2 counts. Shadow definitely wouldn't want to leave sight of land, on a boat especially, and I bet he'd think it was a job for an idiot human. Namely me again. We drop his ashes overboard. Should be enough salt down there to contain him until the devil remembers about him. The evil bastard can haunt pilchards until he gets dragged off into the abyss. I still didn't know his name, but listening to Nell, his first name, middle and surname must all be bastard. There's no need for synonyms when you've found the right word. Okay, I said. Shadow had disappeared by morning. I didn't know if he'd gone off to fight aliens on the other side of the galaxy, or if he just didn't want to help with the clearing up. Shadow's a smart cat. We'd stayed over to keep Nell company. I barely slept, and we were up ridiculously early the next day. It was a lovely sunny morning and I hadn't been to Dublin in years. And after the previous night's experiences I was looking forward to the trip. The sea was relatively calm, and I'm sure I saw a large dolphin leap out of the water about halfway across. The blue sky and stiff breeze were uplifting. Definitely an antidote to the previous night's darkness. We decided to get it over and done with as soon as possible, And so we'd turned up as foot passengers and stayed on the deck all the time. Nell had insisted. And all the while she stayed by the railing, holding her bag tightly. When she unpacked the large misshapen white block of salt containing the bastard's soul from her bag, I could have sworn I saw a large dark shadow materialize and stagger across the deck toward us. "Throw it," I shouted in panic. I'd seen enough weird shit to know that weird shit happens. Nell just dropped it over the side. I pulled her back as we both saw a grayness pursuing the encased ashes into the sea, accompanied by a fading scream that could have been a seagull. "I think not." "Look out, fishies," she shouted after it, and turned her back to the railing and beamed up at me. "Should have thought of that ages ago. Now that's done, I'll buy you a pint of Guinness when we get to Dublin." I felt faint for a moment, then realized it was just another big bag full of unwanted stress leaving my system. "And I'll buy you a nice lunch," I said. "You do that? And I'll do my best to find you a gorgeous Irish colleen." "Sounds good to me," I said. "There's one specific requirement though." She laughed and held onto my arm. "And what's that?" "She has to be breathing." We turned around, arm in arm, and gazed out over the healing sea. "Did you really have sex against a gravestone?" "Every single one of them." She brushed her hair behind her ears. "We worked our way through the alphabet of surnames of people we'd both despised. Just to remind the self-righteous buggers that they were dead." "Worth the lichen burns then?" "Absolutely. Well worth it. It means you'll have to find a really large graveyard for you and your hot Irish girlfriend."